how did you become homeless? Well, at first very slowly and then very suddenly. You can certainly say something about this, the same about the decline of empires. However, the US, unfortunately, is kind of far away from that point. Nevertheless, some important things have been happening recently that contribute to this slow decline of that empire. In the last fortnight alone, a Cuban coup plot failed, Nicaragua left the OAS, and Honduras returned their Castros to power. Aside from Latin America, some bigger players, chiefly Russia and China, are letting it be known that they are no longer tolerant of the US's posturing around the world. Joining us tonight is Ben Norton. He's a journalist for the Grayzone and assistant editor. He's one of the most important independent publishers in our time. He's previously written for Salon, The Intercept, The Real News, Alternate, and has also contributed to Democracy Now! And Al Jazeera. He also has his own show called Propaganda Today, which is very good if you haven't watched it already. But he'll be taking us through this conversation on the relationship between those players and basically the pushback of the new Cold War. Ben, over to you.
Thanks for having me. Thanks for those really kind words. I hope I can live up to them, but it really means a lot to speak to all you comrades here. And thanks for having me back. Now, I'm going to begin this by saying that the last time I was here, I was really honored, and thanks for having me. I do feel bad because I blabbered the entire time and didn't give a lot of time for comments. So today I'm gonna talk less and have more room for conversation, especially because I think this kind of topic is something that is even more directly relevant to our lives, because more so than US imperialism and so-called foreign policy in Latin America and all that. I mean, we can have an influence, but it's very distant from us. But I think the left in the imperial core needs to play a very important role in pushing back against this new Cold War. And I think especially you all in Europe play an extremely important role, which I'll talk about today. So we'll keep it a little more conversational. And I'll begin by saying that when we're talking about the new Cold War, or I've been recently just calling it the second Cold War, right? Because when you were in the Second World War, I mean, I guess people just call it the war, but I guess after the fact, you call it the Second World War. But we're in a new Cold War, and we keep saying new. I think it's actually more effective to say Second Cold War. The first Cold War was from roughly 1945 to 1991. Let's not forget that the first major act of the first Cold War was the US dropping nuclear bombs on Japan, which had nothing to do with defeating Japanese fascism. It was a warning, a threat to the Soviet Union, which was on the verge of liberating Japan from fascism. It was the US telling the Soviet Union that Japan is basically our colony. And still today, Japan is militarily occupied by tens of thousands of US troops. So the first Cold War, you know, we can say it ended in 91, but in some ways, the US geopolitical rivalry with Russia didn't really necessarily end. Of course, we did see Boris Yeltsin, who was this neoliberal alcoholic who just followed Washington's orders for the most part. But pretty quickly after that, Russia, it turned back to a capitalist path, but a nationalist path that it was independent of US hegemonic domination, that tried to pursue an independent path to develop its country. Again, capitalist, we should have open eyes. Russia is certainly not a socialist power like China, but it did develop an independent national path. And very quickly, we saw the US waging proxy wars on Russia through the war in Georgia, through the conflicts in Chechnya, and now with Ukraine. And we can talk about South Ossetia and these other conflicts. But the point is that since the early 2000s, we've seen constant US geopolitical, I mean, not just US, of course, the European Union and NATO as a unifying force has played a key role in these conflicts. But I think especially now, we've seen a new axis emerge, a new pole emerge. Pole is better than axis. For years now, people have been talking about a geopolitical reorientation toward a multipolar world. And I think that is a very useful concept, but more and more it's looking less multipolar and more bipolar. So the United States is holding this so-called democracy summit this December, next week. And the US invited its allies from and protectorates and proxies from across the world, including, I want to stress, Juan Guaido, who has never won a single vote to be so-called president. So he has absolutely no democratic mandate. He was invited by Biden to represent Venezuela. The far-right narco regime in Colombia, led by Ivan Duque, who stole the election by buying votes with drug money from a Colombian drug lord named Nene Hernandez. We have the leaked recordings proving this. He is representing Colombia at this so-called democracy summit. The far-right Hindu nationalist regime in India of the BJP of Prime Minister Narendra Modi is also invited, because we see that the US is trying to bring India into its camp. We also see that the US has created this new institution called the Quad. The Quad consists of the US, Australia, and Japan and India. And this is very explicitly an anti-China alliance. It's not yet a military alliance, but Washington wants it to be a military alliance. It's being referred to as the anti-China NATO, even though NATO is the anti-China NATO. And finally, we see the emergence as well, not the emergence rather, but we see the strengthening on the other side of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. We see that Iran signed a historic 25-year economic agreement worth many billions of dollars with China for economic cooperation. So the point, I mean, that's a lot of information there. I'll unpack some of it, but I think we have to understand that what we're seeing right now is the emergence of these poles that, instead of being a multipolar world, have turned these global geopolitics and geoeconomics into a bipolar system, where the US, in this so-called democracy summit that's coming up next week, is basically telling the world, just as George W. Bush said, you're either with us or you're against us. That was a Republican president, George W. Bush, and now we see the Democratic president, Joe Biden, who, when he can give a coherent speech, which, when he's not talking about his golden leg hairs and time being a lifeguard, I mean, his actual policies are not very different. And we can look at the State Department of Antony Blinken, who is a hardcore ideological imperialist. Antony, the joke was that until recently, that the only difference between Antony Blinken and Mike Pompeo, the former Trump's Secretary of State, was one eats way more hamburgers, although it looks like Mike Pompeo pumped his stomach or something. So now they're pretty much identical in not just their politics, but in their form as well. I mean, Blinken he was one of the main figures who oversaw the war in Syria. He was a main figure who oversaw the war that destroyed Libya in 2011. Let's not forget, this was a NATO war led by the US, the UK, and France to destroy the most prosperous country in Africa. And Antony Blinken played an important role in that in the Obama administration. And Antony Blinken played a key role in the war on Yemen, which is still continuing. And we see that the Biden administration claimed, when Biden first came into office, a few weeks after he entered, he claimed that he would be ending support for so-called offensive operations in Yemen, which is ridiculous. He said that the US would only support defensive operations, but by the very nature of the Saudi war in Yemen is that it is an offensive war that Saudi Arabia initiated in March 2015 with the backing of the United States and Britain. And it was bombing and continues to bomb its southern neighbor, which by definition is not defensive. You can't defend yourself by bombing your southern neighbor. So we see that the Biden administration has continued support. The Blinken State Department has continued selling weapons to Saudi Arabia. And now they have this democracy summit that is further drawing these lines in the sand, saying that these are the different poles. And increasingly, we now see that China and Russia are on the verge of forming an alliance. And we see that, in an incredible development, the Chinese and the Russian ambassadors to the United States just published a joint declaration in a US media outlet called The National Interest, which is like a kind of liberal but realist foreign policy magazine. that represents the kind of, I mean, not like the hardcore neoconservative types, but the people who consider themselves to be a little less hawkish, but are still imperialists and still support NATO and all of that. So anyway, the point is that this magazine published a very interesting joint statement published by the Chinese and Russian ambassadors, in which they said that the Democracy Summit is a way of dividing the world, and they condemned what they called the Cold War mentality of the United States, which is when foreign diplomats are accusing the US of Cold War mentalities, then it's pretty clear what they're hinting at there. They're warning that this is a new Cold War. We also saw, interestingly and correctly, that the Chinese and Russian diplomats said that the US is not democratic, that the US claims to be democratic, but in fact denies democracy to its own people. And they had a comment saying, when we see videos of police responding to protests with tear gas and rubber bullets, that doesn't seem very free and democratic. They also pointed out that in order to call yourself democratic, it can't just include domestic policy, but also international policy, and that the US is not democratic in its international policy. It's actually authoritarian and effectively an international dictatorship that bullies countries and forces them to do what it wants. So we see increasingly that China and Russia are acting, that the statement is important because it shows that, one, they're acting in tandem. And we see geopolitical analysts, very smart analysts, saying that it's very likely that they're going to form an official alliance soon. We've seen that China and Russia are doing military exercises, and we see that their comments are being more forceful, which is relatively new. I mean, Russia's comments on foreign policy have often been very forceful for years, but China, until the last few years, China took a policy, as Deng Xiaoping famously said, of lie low and bide time. And they were trying not to stir trouble. They were not challenging imperialism, frankly. They were sometimes in some ways collaborating. But in the past decade, especially with the rise of Xi Jinping, we've seen that China has really asserted itself as an independent power against Western imperialism, has been a voice for, in international relations, really sovereignty, helping to defend Venezuela, and working closely with Venezuela to prevent the economy from exploding due to US sanctions, which are totally illegal. China has played a major role in a campaign to try to lift the illegal US blockade on Cuba. China has been playing a role to try to end the war in Syria, which is still going on. China's played a role to try to end the war in Yemen. So increasingly, China has played a more assertive role, basically abandoning the old policy of lie low and buy time. China has asserted that it has developed the productive forces of its economy to such a degree now that it's beginning to implement more and more socialist policies of cracking down on billionaires, of cracking down on capital, of reining in private education, of reining in private media. So not only while that is happening, not only do we see those developments, but we see the coherent development of this kind of axis that you could call Eurasian, that includes not just Russia, but also Belarus is an important part of this, parts of West Asia, especially Iran, and also parts of Central Asia. So Kazakhstan, I mean, let's not forget that also the Astana talks were going on in Central Asia over the war in Syria. The point is that there's all these developments happening that you're not going to see mentioned in mainstream corporate media. I think it's extremely important to understand all of this context, because it shows that this bipolar conflict is not, I do not think it's accurate to call it an inter-imperialist rivalry. There are some people, especially Trotskyites, who are trying to put this World War I analysis onto the developments that we're seeing today. And that analysis is not in any way relevant. What we're not seeing is an inter-imperialist rivalry between the Eurasian powers and the US, NATO, EU axis, but rather I would say you can see it ideologically expressed. So not only in the sense that China has total control over the commanding heights of the economy. So yes, there's a lot of debate on the left over the Chinese economy. I think a lot of that debate is frankly irrelevant and academic, because the point of socialism is to not only to control the state to wield the state. It's the dictatorship of the working class controlling the state. It's the dictatorship of the proletariat. You cannot say in China that the capitalist class, I mean, there is a small capitalist class. You cannot say that it rules the state. It certainly does not rule the state. There's things to criticize, but it does not rule the state. The state is very much disciplining the capitalist class more and more. But even aside from that, the point of socialism, aside from the academic arguments, is to make life better for workers and to discipline capitalists, to eventually expropriate capitalists, to eventually remove the capitalist class and have total rule by the working class. And that's a historical process that China has been going through. But anyway, the point is that it's clear that there's an ideological difference there. The Chinese government controls the banking sector, which is extremely important, something that we don't think about. The Chinese economy is not nearly as financialized as the US and even the Irish economy. The Chinese economy is a productive economy, which the US is, since deindustrialization, has been a consumer-oriented and service sector economy. The estimates are that over 70% of US GDP comes from the service sector, not production. So where is the production? The production is in the global South. You can't have an economy without production. So what you do is you have super exploitation of labor in the global South in the supply chain, and that's where the production is. And then you have a service economy, service-oriented economy in the imperial core, which is what the US economy is in parts of the European economies. China has a productive economy. And so the point is that there is an ideological division. In the case of the Russian economy, it is definitely capitalist, but Russia still maintains discipline over the capitalist class. Russia still maintains large control over its hydrocarbons reserves, which are extremely important in terms of the massive oil and gas reserves in Russia, which not only play a role in the Russian economy, but also play a role in geopolitics. So now we see that in Europe, there is this crisis going on, in scare quotes, I mean, we can call it a crisis, with increasing prices of hydrocarbons, of oil and gas, which, I mean, it is important for the world eventually to get off, but being realistic, I mean, these economies are still very heavily reliant, and the winter is here. And if people want to live through winter, not only just comfortably, if they want to survive through winter, they need heat, and heat is still coming from hydrocarbons mostly. So we see the role that Ukraine is playing in this crisis. Ukraine, as a gas transit state, doesn't want to buy gas and oil from Russia. So Russia has recently created the Nord Stream 2 pipeline that circumvents Ukraine. And Russia has said that in a few years, they're basically going to cut off Ukraine as a transit state, which is going to cut off potentially billions of dollars in annual revenue going to Ukraine. It's also going to prevent Ukraine from siphoning off the Russian gas that Ukraine has been using, because Ukraine has this insane policy where they refuse to buy gas from Russia. So instead, Ukraine buys gas from European Union member states who are buying that gas from Russia. So what Ukraine is doing is buying Russian gas, but from Europeans, but then siphoning it off in the gas pipeline that goes through Ukraine, but it's Russian gas. So we see this ridiculous geopolitical dance happening where the European powers and Ukraine, which is a kind of NATO protectorate, are saying they don't want to buy Russian gas and oil, but they need Russian gas and oil. And of course, they're also being disciplined by the US, which imposed sanctions threatening the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. And Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State in the United States, said that the US would, quote, do anything to try to prevent the construction of Nord Stream 2. It's now developed. There was a delay, but it's probably going to be online next year. So there are massive geopolitical shifts happening, and oil and gas play a key role in this. And we see that in Europe, you all are very geostrategically located in this conflict. So this gets back to the other parts I was talking about of the ideological differences. So Russia is certainly capitalist, although you can argue about whether or not it is the economy as neoliberal as the US economy, certainly, and as even some Western European neoliberal economies. And I would highly recommend the work of the economist Michael Hudson, who has been an advisor to the Chinese and also Russian governments, and has some interesting writing articles. You can go to his website, Michael Hudson. He has really good books. He just published a new edition of his book, Super Imperialism, and we've interviewed him. And he explicitly, his argument, which is a very convincing argument, is that the new Cold War, like the first Cold War, is also ideological in the sense that not only does China have many socialist policies and control over the commanding heights of the economy, not only is 1/3 of Chinese GDP from state-owned industries, and that number is increasing, but even in Russia, there is more state control over the economy than in many Western capitalist countries. Although certainly in Russia, there's definitely room for criticism there with the economy. Russia is the second most unequal after the United States. So second most unequal country after the United States. So there's certainly a lot of room to improve there. But anyway, the point is that we have to resist this idea that the new Cold War is an inter-imperialist rivalry. It's not. Not only is that ideologically expressed, and not only is that materially expressed through the actual material conditions, looking at the economies of these countries, looking at the class power exercise in these countries, especially in a place like China, but also it's especially true in terms of ideology and imperialism. So we have to understand that imperialism, like it's dialectical, like any ideological force, any political force, it is ideologically reinforced by material relations. So the material relations of global South countries whose economies are entirely reliant on exporting to the imperial core, on extraction of raw materials, on super exploitation of labor and all of that. It's also ideologically materially reinforced through the funding of education programs and textbooks and think tanks and so-called experts and the media. And it's materially reinforced through institutions like the World Bank and the IMF. If you're a country in the global South and you want to develop an infrastructure program, universal healthcare, education, and you need money, well, where are you going to get that money from? I mean, if you have resources that you can extract and export, then you can have that revenue. But if you don't have natural resources and you have to get access to capital, then you might be blocked, especially if you're a revolutionary country and you're under sanctions. And so the point is that there's an entire infrastructure that materially reinforces imperialism and that materially reinforces neoliberalism. So that's why the economist Michael Hudson, again, I would recommend watching his lectures, reading his books, reading his articles. He often makes the argument that that neoliberalism is not just an ideology. Neoliberalism is a force that is a political and economic force that is materially reinforced and imposed by imperialism. That's obvious in the case of the World Bank and the IMF imposing structural adjustment programs, but also in the sense that the US dollar is still the de facto global reserve currency, although we see China and Russia de-dollarizing. We see this new Eurasian axis de-dollarizing, doing trade in different currencies like the Chinese yuan, the Russian ruble. We see that Iran is doing trade not only with different currencies, but they're doing trade with Venezuela just purely in oil, getting rid of currency. So we see that Iran is also helping to develop this important new axis in Latin America, working closely with Venezuela. A major energy monitoring company just published a report showing how every month, basically, Iran has been sending 2 million barrels of materials that are used to dilutants that are used to dilute the very heavy crude in Venezuela, because Venezuela does have the largest oil reserves in the world, but those are extremely heavy. That's extremely heavy crude. It's some of the heaviest crude in the world. And in order to, one, use it, or two, export it, you have to dilute that oil. And you can do it with naphtha, or you can do it with lighter crude, or you can do it with other dilutants that are being imported from Iran. Originally, Venezuela was actually getting some of that from the United States and other Western countries. But then with the US embargo imposed by Donald Trump in 2019, And with the US sanctions that began before Trump, under Obama, Venezuela was not able to import the dilutants. But now Iran is sending millions of barrels of dilutants, and Iran is in return accepting Venezuelan crude as payment. So that we see the emergence of this axis, which is again very much part of this Eurasian axis, because we saw that Iran was recently admitted as a full member of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And there are discussions of turning the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which was originally created as largely a political organization about security revolving around extremist kind of Salafi jihadist groups in Central Asia. It's becoming more and more an economic alliance. And there's discussion of turning the Shanghai Cooperation Organization into a potential military alliance with a military component, which could be complicated because India and Pakistan are both members. So that's an inherent and internal contradiction there. But the point is that we see the coherence of this axis that is emerging, that is also not only an axis not only an alliance geographically, but also internationally. And this gets me to the point I was saying about the other reason why portraying this new Cold War, the second Cold War, as an inter-imperialist rivalry is simply not accurate, because we also see that in addition to the material differences in the Chinese and Russian economies, and certainly the Iranian economy, which for all you want to criticize about the Iranian government, and there's certainly things that I'm not a fan of, although it's not my country and I'm not Iranian, so it's for the Iranian people to decide their own country. We should recognize that the Iranian economy has much more state control than many Western neoliberal economies. And let's not forget that the US sanctions targeting the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, that is not only targets the IRGC as a military force, but the IRGC has significant control over sectors of the economy, which is effectively state control. I mean, the military and the state in Iran they're not exactly the same, but they're very much part of the kind of same political apparatus. And there's actually a lot of criticism from the liberal so-called reformists in Iran of the role that the state has in the economy. And ironically, the reformists, who are often praised by kind of Western liberals, people like Rouhani, the most recent president, ironically, their economic program is pretty neoliberal, whereas the so-called conservatives or so-called hardliners, which is not an accurate term. I mean, you can call them actually nationalists more, and they're also economic nationalists. So again, I'm not going to romanticize them and say that they're, revolutionary socialists, but Ibrahim Raisi, the current Iranian president, is much more of an economic nationalist. He's not talking about freeing the market. He's not interested in Western foreign investment and foreign corporations investing in the Iranian economy. He's much more interested in developing domestic production, working with China, working with other countries in Asia, and being part of the coherent bloc that's emerging of this kind of Eurasian Shanghai Cooperation Organization bloc. So that is another important element of this ideological distinction between these sides. We see this very clearly with the US's use of language of the so-called rules-based international order, in which the US makes the rules and in which international is defined as the so-called international community, which means all the white countries. It means the US, parts of Europe, actually excluding certain parts of Europe, and Australia and New Zealand, and so the Five Eyes countries. So increasingly, the US government, this is especially since Blinken came to the helm of the State Department, has been using this language of the rules-based international order, not international law. And we should be clear, those are two separate things. They're not the same. International law is something that is very clearly articulated in the Geneva Conventions, articulated by United Nations Security Council resolutions, articulated by the UN Charter. And it's something that you can study in school. If you go study international law, it is something that is similar in most countries in the world. The rules-based international order doesn't mean anything. What it means is what the US wants. It means what Washington and Brussels say are the rules. And this is a concerted attempt being waged by the United States to replace international law. And we see this very clearly in the statements issued by what you could call this Eurasian bloc, right? They very clearly have criticized the use of this language and said that international decisions should be undergirded by international law, by UN Security Council resolutions. So that is a serious ideological distinction, which is not a distinction without a difference. It is a major political distinction in terms of these two blocs in this bipolar second Cold War we're talking about. One side uses the idea of democracy, as we see with this democracy summit, to bully and oppress and overthrow foreign governments and impose its own neoliberal structural adjustment in the name of democracy promotion. And on the other side, we see countries that are based on national sovereignty and respect for self-determination. China has bilateral relations with many countries in the global south as part of its Belt and Road Initiative. And China does not impose structural adjustment. China does not tell them that they need to cut the minimum wage, that they need to cut Social Security, that they need to privatize the health sector. It doesn't do what the IMF and the World Bank do. Now, if you don't believe me, I mean, you can even listen to Yanis Varoufakis, who there are a lot of people on the left who have rightfully criticized him. Yanis Varoufakis is the former economic minister of the Syriza government in Greece. But even Yanis Varoufakis has been making very interesting comments about China and saying, look, in my experience with China, they do not impose the kind of conditions for economic support and for trade and infrastructure development that the Western imperialist powers have. It's fundamentally different. Now, it's not to say that China is doing everything out of the good kindness of its heart, but it's a fundamentally politically and economically and materially different relation that we're talking about here that is not as subordinate. We've also seen that the Financial Times has reported on China's massive debt forgiveness and debt restructuring for countries largely in the global south. And in the case of Cuba, a symbol of socialism around the world, China has forgiven many billions of dollars of debt. And if you look, over 2/3 of the debt that China has forgiven or restructured have been global south countries, largely in Africa. So these are fundamentally different relations. It's not an inter-imperialist rivalry. It is a rivalry based on one side, frankly, on imperialism and continued unipolar domination, because since the overthrow of the socialist bloc in 1991, the US was exercising unipolar domination of the planet. Former CIA director turned president George H.W. Bush, former CIA director, never forget that. He famously declared the New World Order, which, I often say this, it has nothing to do with the Illuminati and lizard people and whatever. No, the New World Order, as he declared it, was US unipolar hegemonic domination of the planet. We saw sophists, these fake philosophers like Francis Fukuyama, declare the end of history, that neoliberalism was the new form of government around the world, that the US, as the leader of capitalism, as the hegemon, would enforce that neoliberal hegemony across the planet. And we saw it even imposed briefly under Yeltsin in Russia. And this colonization, because let's keep in mind, when we're talking, like I said, neoliberalism is not just an ideology. It is a political, it's a geoeconomic and political system that is enforced by imperialism, in which the IMF and the World Bank, in which the US has veto power unilaterally, governs international economics, which means they govern international politics, which means that, as Nkrumah said, in talking about the national liberation struggles in Africa, even if you have political autonomy on paper, even if you have political independence, your economy is governed by the World Bank and the IMF, which means by Wall Street, which means you don't have sovereignty. So on one side of this bipolar new Cold War, you have one side calling for continued control of financial capital over the entire world. And the other side, you have an axis that is calling for defense of national sovereignty. And this has also been asserted in the creation of a new political bloc which complements the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. It complements the economic agreement signed between China and Iran. It complements the growing military alliance between China and Russia. We also see this political diplomatic formation at the United Nations of something called the Group of Friends in Defense of the UN Charter. The Group of Friends in the Defense of the UN Charter, it's not a very creative, interesting name. I mean, it says what it is. This is 24 countries roughly that are mostly in the global south, and many of them are socialist. Others have revolutionary nationalist governments like the Iranian government, and they are calling for, this is exactly what I'm saying, they're calling for the creation of a political and economic system based on respect for national sovereignty. And we see, what are the founding members of this? Venezuela played a key role in creating this. Venezuelan diplomats are extremely impressive. And Samuel Moncada, the Venezuelan representative to the UN, really punches above his weight. The Venezuelan, Nicaraguan, and Cuban ambassadors in international institutions are extremely impressive. For relatively small countries in terms of global politics, they have really played an outsized role in these institutions, in pushing for these new political relations that are based on respect for national sovereignty and self-determination. And we see that not only in the sense that these three countries are parts of the ALBA, which is an attempt to create an economic bloc in the Americas that excludes the US from these so-called free trade agreements, but also we see that Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Cuba are founding members of the Group of Friends in Defense of the UN Charter. Venezuela also co-sponsored and hosted the second last, not the most recent, the second last meeting of the Nonaligned Movement, which was held in Caracas 2 years ago. And this is another organization that is part of this. When I'm talking today about the Second Cold War, we also need to understand the material forces, the institutions behind them. And these alliances and these institutions are important in terms of understanding the bipolar world that we're increasingly moving toward. And the non-aligned movement has clearly allied itself with the axis led by China and Russia. And not only because they are working together closely, not only because they're observers in the non-aligned movement, but also because increasingly the same leaders of the non-aligned movement are forming institutions like the Group of Friends in Defense of the UN Charter with China and Russia. So let me go through here other members of the Group of Friends in Defense of the UN Charter: China, Russia, Palestine, Iran, Syria, Venezuela, Nicaragua, Cuba, Eritrea, Laos, and the DPRK. And unfortunately, I'm sure I'm missing a few. St. Vincent and the Grenadines. So anyway, the point is that we're seeing the coherent emergence of this other pole, which is based on respect for self-determination and national sovereignty. And you can't implement socialism in your country. You can't even have resource nationalism and economic nationalism in your country if you have global financial capital from Wall Street, from the city of London, from Brussels, imposing their will on your country. So finally, this leads me to the last part, and then I want to open up for like a conversation and questions and things like that. I want to talk about what the role that Europe is going to play in this, because what I'm spelling out here is that in the past 10, 15 years, we've seen very clearly this bifurcation of global geopolitics, and we've also seen that there are certain places in global politics, certain geographies that play a key role in this. And in the Pacific region, we've seen that there's a lot of conflict over the new Cold War. We see that the US government under the Obama administration declared the pivot to Asia. This was under the Hillary Clinton State Department. And we saw that the Obama administration began using this language, talking about the Asian Pacific region, trying to spell out this new region. And now over half of US military resources deployed abroad are in the Asia Pacific region. And that number is increasing. When troops leave Afghanistan, they're not going home. They're going to the Asian Pacific region. when troops, if they do leave Iraq, as Biden claimed he would, they're going to the Asian Pacific region. So this is a major point of geopolitical conflict. The Philippines plays a key role as a swing state in this new Cold War, where for the Philippine government plays the U.S. and China against each other. 1 week it's allied with the U.S., 1 week it's allied with China. It has this very opportunistic policy. And then we also see India playing a huge role in this. And the far-right BJP government of Narendra Modi has made it very clear that it is mostly in the US NATO camp. I mentioned that it's part of the Quad, but also India has taken a very aggressive line against China. We see that China and India had a border skirmish. They've actually had multiple border skirmishes. And let's not forget, in the 1960s, they actually fought a war against each other. So India is pretty firmly leaning into the US-led camp, and Pakistan is very firmly in the China camp. And if you look at a lot of UN resolutions that are being presented by China and Russia, like, for instance, the most recent resolution condemning Nazism and racism, I did a video about that you can find on YouTube at the Grayzone. That resolution that's introduced every year at the United Nations, which is co-authored by China and Russia and Vietnam and Venezuela and Cuba and Nicaragua and Belarus and Bolivia. It's also co-authored, interestingly, by Pakistan. Pakistan is one of those countries that plays a very complex role in terms of imperialism as well. It's certainly not like some anti-imperialist bastion at all. I mean, talk to Bangladesh about that. But, it is playing an interesting role as a Chinese ally. So the point I'm saying is that there are different regions of the world where, as the new Cold War accelerates, conflict is going to become hot. And we're going to see an increasing number of contradictions that start breaking. And there's going to be a point at which these countries are going to have to pick a side and are going to have to make important economic and political decisions. And one of those regions of the world is certainly Europe, very much Europe. Now, in Latin America, there are revolutionary governments here. I'm in Nicaragua right now that have been asserting an independent voice, working with China and Russia and Iran, trying to be part of this new axis. But unfortunately, with the reality of US geopolitics, the extent to which they could militarily have any alliance with China or Russia is not really it seems very unlikely. And especially given how wary China is China has one foreign military base in Djibouti. Russia has a few more, but you can count them on one or two hands. So it's unlikely that they're going to be militarily have any presence in South America or Central America. And the U.S. has been invoking the Monroe Doctrine, this 200-year-old colonial doctrine, saying that Latin America is basically the U.S. backyard. So in Latin America, there is this kind of conflict, but it's not going to be a swing, unfortunately. There's going to be a lot of resistance against U.S. imperialism, but the U.S. is really aggressively trying to impose its will on Latin America. And I think it's more useful to think of Latin America as a kind of independent force where there are revolutionary and progressive forces that are allying with the Eurasian bloc, but they're not going to be integrated into the Eurasian bloc. And so anyway, the point is that Europe plays an important role in this. And we see this with the conflict in Ukraine right now, because basically there are forces, as you all know better than I do, in the European ruling class that are very much on board with this project. They love the United States, and they think that the future of Europe rests in this kind of cross-Atlantic imperialist bloc that was created at the beginning of the First Cold War. So just as the Organization of American States was created at the beginning of the First Cold War in 1948 as an alliance of anti-communist right-wing regimes in Latin America, in 1949, the US created NATO as an alliance of anti-communist regimes in Europe, in the United States, against the socialist bloc, and increasingly against not only Russia, but also China. The General Secretary of NATO recently gave this speech in which he said, and there was a meeting of NATO members in which they said that basically their mission for the future is not only countering Russia, but also countering China. So they're repurposing this bloc that was created originally to counter the Soviet Union and the socialist bloc, and now against this Eurasian bloc. And in the case of Europe, we see that there is this, the left is very confused. And this is where you all come in. And this is to an extent in the US left. I mean, we're trying to be part of this, but it's more directly relevant to Europe. We're seeing this coherent, we're seeing this kind of division emerge between this kind of liberal left that is dedicated to defending the European Union, no matter at what cost, no matter if they have to keep imposing neoliberal policies, no matter if they have to keep brutalizing immigrants while they cynically exploit the rhetoric of the EU supposedly being an institution that defends the rights of immigrants. I don't know what planet they're living on. Have they seen what's going on right now with Belarus, with this border conflict where Ukraine has been killing these immigrants and refugees, and the European Union is totally supporting Ukraine? Or basically the concentration camps, the mass internment camps that were created. I mean, the European Union has never been a friend of immigrants, but you all know better than I that there's this kind of soft liberal left that is responsible for destroying Jeremy Corbyn with their demand that there had to be a second referendum, and that is also involved in this narrative that if you oppose US, NATO, EU imperialism, that you're in a red-brown alliance. If you're a socialist who is anti-imperialist and doesn't want war with China and Russia and Iran, and supports self-determination and national sovereignty, especially for countries, formerly colonized countries like China and Iran and Venezuela and Nicaragua, and even, Belarus. Like, Belarus has a right to self-determination and national sovereignty. And it has a right to defend itself from attempts at a Western color revolution to overthrow its government and impose neoliberal structural adjustment, like they did in the Baltic states, like they did in Ukraine, like they did in Russia in the 1990s. So there's this narrative, a very nefarious but effective narrative, saying that if you oppose all of that, if you understand this global realignment that we're seeing, and you refuse to take the side of Western imperialism, then you're in an alliance with fascists, and that Russia is fascist and China is fascist, and China is the new Nazi Germany. And in order to defeat those so-called fascists, we have to ally with Ukrainian Nazis, and we have to ally with Al-Qaeda in Syria, and we have to ally with the Turkestan Islamic, the Turkestan Islamic Party, which is an Al-Qaeda affiliate in Xinjiang in Western China. And we have to ally with far-right extremist ultranationalists in the Baltic states who are trying to rewrite the history of the Holocaust to make the Nazi collaborators into the heroes. But we have to do that to defend Western liberal democracy. You don't understand. NATO has to produce documentaries honoring the Forest brothers, Baltic Nazi collaborators, because they're defending Western liberal democracy. The US and Canadian militaries have to train the neo-Nazi Azov battalion in Ukraine, which has the white sun symbol, which is a white supremacist symbol, as their official logo, and uses a Wolfsangel Nazi-style symbol as their official symbol. The Azov battalion is officially integrated into the Ukrainian National Guard. There are photos of US and Canadian military officers meeting and posing for photos with these Ukrainian Nazis. But if you don't support them, then you're in a red-brown alliance with Russian and Chinese fascists against Ukrainian neo-Nazis. It's absolutely absurd. But this is the propaganda narrative it's being used to try to defend Western imperialism. And in the case of Britain, it was very effective in destroying Jeremy Corbyn and portraying him as an anti-Semite, and portraying him as soft on terrorism or whatever, and portraying him as a Russian agent, and portraying him as in an alliance with fascists because he doesn't support the neoliberal European Union and he wanted a left-wing Brexit. So now we have a right-wing Brexit. And especially in a country like Ireland, a country that does have a history of national liberation struggles, that understands the importance of sovereignty and self-determination, and also that understands that the European Union is a neoliberal institution, as we see with a lot of Irish economic policies. So the last thing I'll end on here is that I think for you all, I'm interested in hearing your thoughts. I think for you all, more than people in the US, for you all, this new Cold War is going to be not necessarily hot in terms of armed conflict, although we'll see armed conflict probably in Ukraine in the years to come, and who knows in other parts of Eastern Europe and Central Europe. But Europe is another kind of potential swing location. And I don't expect Europe to like firmly take the side of the non-aligned movement and the group of friends in defense of the UN Charter and this kind of anti-imperialist pole that it has emerged. But Europe can definitely play a positive role as a mediating power that refuses to buy this narrative that they have to live in this bipolar world and that they can have friendly and positive relations. Like I said, I'm not expecting Europe to become a bastion for anti-imperialism, although who knows, with Ireland, I mean, there is a history of anti-imperialism and there's more hope there certainly than in like France or England. But Europe is this swing player. And we see that now with German policy, with German gas imports from Russia, with the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. We see that with declarations that Europe is not being as aggressive against China, although there are certainly liberal imperialists who are very anti-China. It's a complicated, I think for you all, it's going to be a more complicated struggle. And I think especially for socialists and anti-imperialists in Europe, I think the argument to make is that we need to choose the side in defense of self-determination and national sovereignty, especially for countries in the periphery, in the global south. And we want to ally with progressive and anti-imperialist forces and tell these dumb left liberals who think they're so smart because they can criticize policies in Iran and criticize policies in Belarus and whatever, and they think they're so smart and they talk about authoritarianism, whatever. Meanwhile, they're the ones allied with the international rights. They're the ones allied with international capital. And I'm going to take my political guidance from actually existing socialist countries. I'm going to look closely at the speeches of the leaders of Cuba and Venezuela and Nicaragua and Bolivia. And I'm going to listen to what they're saying. And if you listen to their speeches, they're saying a lot of what I've been saying today. I didn't just get this. I didn't just pull it out of like, my, whatever. Like it's from listening, talking to, thinking about what's this political realignment that's emerging. And I'll say that if you go to the global south and you go to these countries that Western propaganda is trying to convince us that they're becoming so-called neo-colonies of China, that's not what they're saying at all. If you look at actual polls of people in African nations, multiple African nations, there's been studies by Johns Hopkins and other universities, their support for a lot of these infrastructure projects is very high. And they often have a very positive view of China. And in large parts of Latin America, people have a very positive view of China and also Russia. In Nicaragua, certainly. In Venezuela, certainly. Very high, very positive views. So I think that the responsibility of leftists and anti-imperialists in the imperial core, especially people who call themselves socialists, is to ally with those revolutionary movements and understand that we cannot build socialism anywhere by allying with capital, and capital is reinforced through imperialism, and imperialism is the highest stage of capitalism. And to the socialists who love the European Union, to the socialists who were so adamantly against Brexit, to the socialists who are supporting this new Cold War and say China is authoritarian and all this, all I'll say to them is that they're being misled by capital. They're the ones allied with capital, and Wall Street and the city of London and Brussels are never going to support socialism. I'm sorry. Like, They're not going to. So I'm interested in hearing your thoughts about this, because the more and more I look at a lot of this like European left, excluding you comrades, like you all do a lot of really good work, there's like this left liberal European media friendly kind of movement that I think is very destructive. And I think that not only is it destroying its own kind of prospects for domestic transformation, but it's also actively sabotaging any attempts at like creating this kind of new axis that we're talking about, where Europe can actually play a more positive role as an independent force in the new Cold War that says, we don't want a hot war. We don't want an actual nuclear conflict between these nuclear armed powers. And we support self-determination sovereignty. So I spoke a long time again. I shouldn't have said that at the beginning. Now I feel dumb, but maybe we can have a conversation now and take some questions.
I was gonna ask, do you believe that there's a likely future wherein the USA is capable, well, the USA and to an extent the United European Front, although they're fracturing over the past few years. Do you think it is feasible for them to realistically defeat a united Russian-Chinese power bloc the same way they did in the first Cold War? Because in the first Cold War, the Sino-Soviet split was arguably one of the biggest reasons that the US was able to neuter the USSR's foreign policy and thereby, isolate it and kill it economically. So do you think it's still possible for them to win with this alliance intact, or what?
Great question. I mean, it depends what we mean by win. So we have to look at these different powers. So China just surpassed the US as the largest economy in the world. And by the way, a fact that it has not been very highly publicized, although it should be. I mean, because we often, when we think about the new Cold War, the second Cold War, we still kind of think of the first Cold War, in which the socialist bloc was politically and diplomatically influential and militarily influential because the Soviet Union could send weapons to revolutionary forces. And not just the Soviet Union, but we saw Libya and Syria and even Yugoslavia and the DPRK and other countries with, leftist anti-imperialist governments. They would send weapons to countries to help support national liberation movements. But economically, the socialist bloc was pretty weak in terms of the sheer power. I mean, they were able to objectively provide a much better standard of living for their people than most of these countries today. And if you look at a lot of polls, a lot of people in Eastern and Central Europe are very nostalgic because they had an objectively higher standard of living. But in terms of the production capabilities, in terms of exports, the socialist bloc economically was not very strong compared to Western capital. China is a totally different case. I mean, China is now the largest economic power in the entire world, and it's growing, and it continues to grow, certainly much faster than the US economy, which is more and more of a disaster. And again, it's based on a financialized economy, not production. So economically, if you look at go ahead.
I just wanted to ask, was that biggest economy in the world by purchasing price parity, or was it by another metric? Because I'm trying to look that up myself.
Yeah, I believe it was PPP, but this was reported in a few like business outlets. Let me see here. China largest economy. I mean, there's been discussions of this for a while, but this was whatever. There were some articles recently, I'll have to find, but it was reported in some business outlets that China has recently overtaken the US as the largest economy. And so a lot of countries in the global South, especially if they're being forced to pick a side, who do you pick? The rising power or the falling power? It's kind of a no-brainer, right? But then there's the military question. And of course, the US outspends militarily numerous countries combined. And let's keep in mind that if you look at those graphs, they sometimes change because every year the US increases its military budget by tens of billions of dollars. And there are estimates that in the 2030s, the US will probably be approaching a $1 trillion annual military budget. It's now almost $800 billion per year. And that is just on the books, by the way. The Pentagon failed its first and only ever audit. They were unable to do an audit. And there's tens of trillions of dollars in Pentagon spending that has not been accounted for on the books. So anyway, the point is that in terms of sheer US military spending, it's very daunting. And that it also shows that at the end of the day, the power of the US dollar is backed up by the US military. The idea that of this like Pax Americana myth, which hasn't seemed very peaceful. Tell that to Iraq, tell that to Syria, tell that to Panama, tell that to Nicaragua. I mean, it has not, the Pax Americana has not been very peaceful, but tell it to Vietnam. But the point is that the US can threaten any country that tries to get off the dollar, as Muammar Gaddafi did, as even Saddam Hussein. I mean, Saddam Hussein was a CIA ally who the CIA gave Saddam Hussein lists of communists to kill, and he did it. And then the US supported Saddam Hussein against Iran in the Iran-Iraq war. But I mean, Saddam was trying to get off the US dollar. And I mean, those, sometimes you'll hear like dumb, like right-wing libertarians talk about that, but it's true. I mean, it's an actual fact, and that's something that we should consider. But the point is that militarily, the US is still extremely dominant. But I mean, the Chinese and Russian militaries are nothing to scoff at. And increasingly, this is important because in terms of your question about if there is an actual conflict, an armed conflict between these blocs, increasingly we see not only that China and Russia are releasing joint diplomatic statements, not only are they working together at the United Nations and co-sponsoring resolutions, not only are they vetoing resolutions together, but they started using this language recently, which is interesting, of red lines. And they use very similar language in terms of Taiwan and Ukraine. So we now know that the US has admitted to having military forces in Taiwan. The US is training the Taiwanese military and encouraging Taiwanese separatists. Let's not forget that the US has claimed since the 1970s, when it signed 3 different agreements with China in the Nixon era, the US claimed to recognize Taiwan as part of China. It claimed to support the One China policy, although the US has maintained something called a policy of strategic ambiguity. But the US claimed to support the One China policy. But at the same time, the US is now inviting Taiwan to this so-called democracy summit, which is a clear threat to China. And then we see what's going on right now with Ukraine, where the US is basically threatening Russia with a war in Ukraine. And ironically, the US and the European Union are accusing Russia of supposedly wanting to invade Ukraine, which is insane. Meanwhile, Antony Blinken just accused Russia of violating the Minsk Accords. And I would invite Antony Blinken to go back and read the Minsk Accords, because Ukraine has been attacking the Donbass region with Turkish drones in a blatant violation of the Minsk Accords, and no comment. Ukraine, by the way, has also imprisoned and put in house arrest most of the political opposition leaders and has shut down the opposition media outlets without a single peep from the European Union and the US. This has nothing to do with so-called authoritarianism. The US is one of the most authoritarian countries on earth. It has nothing to do with authoritarianism. This is pure on geopolitics and economics. So to your question, I mean, militarily, if the US is crazy enough to start a war, and who knows, the US is a pretty crazy country, and empires, when they're in decline, often do pretty crazy things, like the Turkish Ottoman Empire's genocide, like Nazi Germany, the end of the German Empire, like the French genocide in Algeria toward the end of the French Empire. I mean, French still is an empire if you look at its policies right now in Africa. But the thing is, military is one question, but economically, a lot of countries are looking at China as the rising power and picking China. And we see that with the Belt and Road Initiative. So to answer your question, it's hard to say because it depends what the conflict will look like. But economically, if you're a country in the global south, most countries are putting their bets on the China bloc and not the US bloc.
Uh, Ben, firstly, I'd just like to thank you for the whole talk. I know you always are self-deprecating and don't like talking for an hour, but it's actually very informative. It's good to get a data blast. My question was leading on from the previous question. Instead of seeing a hot conflict, very much like the Cold War, I know the first Cold War, a comparison that you obviously don't like, but it's I think Ethiopia stands out as an example right now where there's a conflict, and obviously I don't see China and Russia getting involved. Now, I think strategically that's probably the better move at the moment, but it's no coincidence that Ethiopia is China's biggest trade partner in Africa. The question is, do we expect to see more of these conflicts, and not even just hot military conflicts as proxies, but things like Lithuania recognizing Chinese Taipei as Taiwan, the real China, and including all of China and Mongolia and bits of Kazakhstan as well. It's like, no, it's insane. But yeah, do we expect to see more of that in the future? And what happens as a result of that?
Great question, and I'm glad you're talking about the situation with Lithuania and Taiwan, because what they were doing there, I mean, it was clearly a move in which they were testing the waters, right? What's the saying where like you dip your toe in the water geopolitically? Lithuania's relations with China are pretty minor. Even its economic relations are not that significant. So this was clearly a decision that was made. Lithuania being a member of the European Union and NATO, being basically a protectorate of NATO. And by the way, Lithuania being one of the main governments that is pushing Holocaust revisionism with the so-called double genocide theory. And for people who don't know, check out Dovyd Kats, who is in Lithuania and has done really good work talking about how the Lithuanian government, with NATO and the EU's approval, has been hosting like all of these state-sponsored marches in honor of Nazi collaborators, but all to own the Soviet Union and all to own Russia, right? So that was clearly a decision that was made with the support of Brussels and Washington. It would not have made that decision, and they wanted to see what China's response would be, and China was furious. You can see the response of China in the Global Times. For people who don't know, the Global Times is the kind of main organ of the Communist Party of China. If you want to understand the thinking of the Communist Party of China, read Global Times. Not CGTN. People often criticize it because sometimes it has bad coverage. CGTN is like, that's not, you got to read Global Times to understand it. So Global Times has viciously condemned Lithuania. In fact, what's interesting is that it's even returned to kind of Maoist era rhetoric of like running dogs and all of that. So we see that this is a point I was trying to get at, of Europe being like a major ground of like a potential swing player. We saw, for instance, like let's look at France's example in the first Cold War. And I want to be real about this. I think it's true. There are some communists, like old school communists, like back before who are not MLM, if you know what I'm like. So not taking in the whole discussion of like the Maoists like split in like when the time like where there was an argument of like revisionists and non-revisionists and all of this. In the 1968 protests in France, there is speculation, and I think there's more than circumstantial evidence, that the CIA and French intelligence and forces that supported colonialism in Algeria supported those protests against de Gaulle, because de Gaulle, even though he was a right-wing nationalist, he was a nationalist that supported French interests over NATO's interests and wanted better relations with the Soviet Union, and was trying to pursue basically rapprochement with the Soviet Union. And after the Sino-Soviet split, which you just mentioned, there were a lot of people who took this line, which I think was a major error. And there's certainly things to criticize about the Soviet Union, and especially Khrushchev, and the idea of peaceful coexistence. And Khrushchev being very soft on imperialism. And I'm not saying that I'm not saying that the Soviet Union is blameless and China bears all the blame, but there was this very real alliance of interests between some Maoists and imperialism. And France is an example of that in 68, but also the even more extreme example of that is what you mentioned. I mean, this was the main factor in the Soviet Union being defeated in the First Cold War, was that some parts, like the anti-revisionists, some of them took this ultra-left view, I would say, that said that capitalist imperialism is a lesser evil compared to so-called social imperialism, which led to China supporting some Mujahideen forces. There were some Maoist Mujahideen in Afghanistan working side by side with the CIA. China supported Pinochet, which is actually a very complex historical thing. I mean, there's a lot to unpack there, and there's things to criticize, but I think what we should understand now is that's past, that's history, and it's very different now. And I think the US strategy was to try to do a reverse Kissingerian visit to China, right? So basically what happened is that Kissinger went to China and in 1971 and had these secret meetings. And then in 1972, Nixon went to China and famously declared the opening, and then basically China allied with imperialism against the Soviet Union. This is well after the Sino-Soviet split, and China invaded Vietnam and supported the Khmer Rouge along with the US. But fast forwarding a lot, now China has very clearly asserted itself as a voice in defense of self-determination. And you mentioned countries like Ethiopia. China is a major trading partner for Ethiopia, and China is defending Ethiopia's territorial sovereignty. And the US is very clearly supporting an attempt to overthrow the Ethiopian government. And if you have to choose in between those two sides, it is not an inter-imperialist rivalry. It is very clear. One side, China, is defending the sovereignty of the Ethiopian people in defense of their government. And one side, the US, is trying to destroy the Ethiopian government, just as it did in Libya in 2011. And Ethiopia doesn't play the same role that Libya did. I mean, Ethiopia has a very complex role. And let's be honest, President Abiy Ahmed is a neoliberal. But increasingly in the past few years, he got the Nobel Peace Prize. The West, they poured love and praise on him, saying that he's our guy. And he wasn't their guy, because at the end of the day, Ethiopia has its own national interests, which are not the same interests as Washington and Brussels. And Ethiopia is one of the most important nodes in the Belt and Road Initiative. Ethiopia has key relations and business with China and refused to give that up. So that's one of the main reasons for this war, to try to destroy the Ethiopian government. And we now see it very clearly articulated. But just because Abiy Ahmed is not a socialist doesn't mean that we shouldn't defend Ethiopia's self-determination and sovereignty against an attack by imperialism. And Ethiopia is being attacked by imperialism, and China and Russia are very clearly on the side of defending Ethiopian sovereignty. So it's not an inter-imperialist rivalry. And I think it's a classic example of this thing that I'm talking about, where there are certain people on the left, especially Trots, who try to obfuscate all of this and act as though everything now is an inter-imperialist rivalry. It's all inter-capitalist conflict. But that's not at all what's happening. And the China now is very different from even the China 15 years ago. I mean, there's people who I respect who say that China's been on this path. And you can say that certainly there's elements of continuity, that China has been on a path of lying low and biding time. But under Xi Jinping, the Communist Party of China has taken a significant left turn. They are significantly asserting their control over capitalist elements, capitalist rotors, if you will, and they are taking a much more aggressive line in defense of sovereignty against imperialism, and asserting themselves as a voice that will defend some of these countries. And all you have to do is look at UN votes. China made a huge mistake, and so did Russia. And to be fair, Medvedev was president at the time. But in 2011, China and Russia abstained on the NATO war in Libya, which basically allowed NATO to destroy Libya. And they have totally learned from that lesson. And since 2011, in one decade, global geopolitics has drastically changed. And I think the war in Libya was one of those watershed moments. And that's why I don't think Ethiopia is going to fall, because of Libya.
Any other questions?
Yeah. You hear me there, Josh?
Yep. Oh, Seamus, you're on mute.
Hello? Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Just say, like Richard Moore last week made a public statement on the BBC, like he's the head of MI6, like a Norton, like the Cold War position. But the only question I want to ask you was, like in Southern America, Central America, and that, is there any possibility of a military alliance rising there, like, between say Nicaragua and Bolivia, Cuba, etc., like Venezuela, and now Honduras, like, the army in Honduras, we know where they stand, like, but is there any possibility of that arising?
That's a great question. There has been a little discussion that, especially when Chavez was alive, but nothing has really come out of it. So we should understand that in Latin America, most of the militaries are colonial. Not only are they trained by the US military, so people probably have heard of the School of the Americas. They recently changed their name to WHINSEC, which is the Western Hemisphere Institute for Coordination or something. It's a horrible name. WHINSEC. No, Western Hemisphere Institute for Security Cooperation, I think is the name. But it's the School of the Americas, or the School of the Assassins. And many military leaders in Latin America were trained there. There's also something called ALALA, which is a police training association. So people probably know that police in the US train with Israeli police using the same kind of tactics that the Israeli police use to brutalize Palestinians. Well, US police use those to brutalize largely Black and brown and poor communities in the US. And so there's a similar policy in Latin America of training military and police forces. So that needs to be mentioned. But also, if you look at the history of a lot of Latin America, most of these militaries are colonial militaries. The military officers were descendants of the mestizos. Those are the European colonialists who had children, sometimes consensual, but often, unconsensual relationships based on rape and massive sexual abuse. So you have like lighter skinned Latin Americans and who consider themselves like white, and they're often more elite, and especially in the military corps. So as a classic example of this, the military coup in Bolivia in 2019 was led by a military general, the head of the Bolivian military, whose name is William Kaliman. His name is certainly not indigenous, right? And you see this very commonly where a lot of the military officer corps are light-skinned descendants of the European elites. And that plays a class role. What I'm saying is that in a lot of Latin America, the military plays a class role as the enforcer of the capitalist class. I mean, that's what all militaries do around the entire world, but it's very clear in Latin America. And in a place like Bolivia, it is extremely blatant because Bolivia, around 2/3 of the population is indigenous, and the military, almost all the officers are light-skinned and have European names. So when Evo Morales was in power, one of the policies he tried to do was to try to proletarianize the military by bringing in more and more poor and working class people and encouraging them to be officers in all of this. And that was a very difficult process, and he did not have that much success because Evo had no military experience. Evo came from the social movements. And this is one of the reasons I think that they have not been able to develop a military alliance. It's because of so many so much U.S. military control over militaries in Latin America through WHINSEC and the School of the Americas training them, through Southcom, that's the Southern Command of the U.S. military training forces in Latin American militaries, because of the class and race dynamics I was talking about, and also because the vast majority of left-wing leaders in Latin America don't come from the military. Hugo Chavez was unique, which is why I mentioned that he was trying to do something. Hugo Chavez was a progressive nationalist military officer. And what I was talking about earlier about nationalism being important, we should keep in mind nationalism. I mean, you all know this certainly very well in Ireland. It's different in the imperial core. There's this discussion in the US about patriotic socialism. I'm not a big fan of it, honestly, because I think it misunderstands the contradiction between patriotism and nationalism in the imperial core versus the periphery. But we should keep in mind that in the vast majority of socialist revolutions in the global South, or rather, let me rephrase that. In the vast majority of socialist revolutions, period, in history, most of them were in formerly colonized countries, and they were also strongly nationalist revolutions. So Vietnam, Korea, Cuba, Nicaragua, Venezuela. I mean, there's so many examples, right? Certainly Burkina Faso, certainly Zimbabwe, right? So nationalism plays an important role in this, and national identity. But the thing is that in Latin America, the militaries have been forces that have been very often anti-nationalist, by forces that are, like I said, these forces that don't have a strong national identity because they have a strong identity with European heritage. So Chavez was a rare example of one of these nationalist military officers who attempted a military coup and he failed. And then he was released from prison and he created a new political party and he won power. And when Chavez came to power, he was not a socialist. He didn't talk about socialism until over 5 years into office. He won his first election in 1998. And in 1999, he came into power and he declared the Bolivarian Revolution, which was a nationalist revolution, an anti-imperialist revolution, but he didn't talk about socialism in the 21st century until 2006, 2007. So anyway, the point is, it's a long answer, but in Latin America, the only really revolutionary nationalist militaries are in Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. That's why these governments have been able to hold on so long, because Bolivia, being the other socialist revolutionary government in the region, the MAS party has no influence basically in the military still today, even after the coup. It's a persistent problem in Bolivia. And it's a lesson in the future for any revolutionary that if you don't control the military, you don't control the state. And Evo Morales, and now with Luis Arce, they really have to try to appease the military because they have so little influence in it. And it's also a sign that these Western left liberal types who talk about authoritarianism don't understand anything about politics. Just because you have political power in the state doesn't mean you control the state. In many ways, political power is one of the weakest parts of the state apparatus. You also have class control in terms of the economy, but you also have the military and the police. So you can win bourgeois elections, but you still don't control the state. If you don't control capital, you certainly don't control the economy. And if you don't control the military and the police, as Evo Morales never did, how much of the state do you actually control? So these are just things to think about. And Evo Morales and now Luis Arce are very cognizant of this, and it's a major issue they think about. And that's why the social movements in Bolivia are so well organized to defend the revolution. And in Venezuela, that's why Hugo Chavez remade the military. He replaced the officer corps and he created a nationalist military. By the way, he tried to have gender parity. He didn't succeed, but with total gender parity, but there's a lot of representation of women in the military. And similarly in Nicaragua, they remade the military as a nationalist military to defend national sovereignty.
All right. Does anyone else have any questions?
I'll go if nobody else would like to. Oh, sorry, Alex submitted a question. I'll stop.
Yeah, Alex said the potential of Europe as a kind of swing region. Germany's traffic light government. Oh, yeah. This is interesting. And like I said, we have to, as socialists, I mean, I'm a socialist. I never hide it. I'm proud of it. I always say I'm a socialist. And but I also think we should understand that especially when we're talking about countries in the imperial core, the subject of nationalism is very complicated. It's very complicated. And especially when we're talking about a country like Germany, I am not interested in talking about German nationalism. German nationalism is bad news, right? And US nationalism, bad news. British nationalism, bad news. In the imperial core, nationalism is bad news. It's almost always reactionary. But what's interesting is that there's a difference between nationalism and sovereignty. And German has its own sovereign interests. It has its own national interests. That doesn't mean being a German nationalist, but it also means that you don't want to subordinate your country to the interests of Brussels and Washington. And what we've clearly seen is that there are forces in the German capitalist class. They're not socialists at all, but they recognize that Germany has national interests, they're bourgeois interests, but they're national interests that aren't the same as the national interests of Washington and Brussels. And this is very clear with the creation of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. And I'm not saying that we should form an alliance with the German national bourgeoisie against the Communist bourgeoisie, because it's more complicated. Like Mao made this analysis in China and in what he called the third world. We should keep in mind, by the way, because there are some people on the left who criticize first, second, third world language. They say it's like racist or something. No, it was Mao Zedong himself who popularized first, second, third world. Now, it's not the same today because it's different than it was when he popularized it back then in terms of the second world. But I mean, I say global south all the time too. We can use them interchangeably. But the point is that nationalism in the third world is usually progressive. And Mao made the distinction between the national bourgeoisie and the Comprador bourgeoisie. And his analysis, which I think is a fair analysis for most global South revolutionary movements, is that at least part of the national bourgeoisie has to play a role in the revolution. And if you look at the Chinese flag, each of the stars represented a different faction in the revolution. The bourgeoisie had its, the national, not the Comprador, the national bourgeoisie had its own star. The intellectuals had their own star. The peasants had their star. The proletariat had a star. The party had a star. So the point is that states have their own national interests, which, if we understand capitalism, imperialism is the highest stage of capitalism, we can also understand those contradictions within the imperialist system. And there are parts of the German capitalist class that are not as pro-European Union and pro-Washington as other parts of the German capitalist class, and that actually are not necessarily supportive of the idea of the second Cold War that's happening, right? Of the new Cold War. And ironically, it is not just the most right-wing elements, but also the Greens being a classic example of what I was talking about. I mean, you can't even necessarily call the Greens left liberal anymore. I mean, they don't even pretend to kind of be left. They're just totally neoliberal from what I've seen. But they use this kind of leftoid orientation to sell imperialism. I mean, honestly, if you told me 10 years ago that the Greens in Europe would be some of the most pro-imperialist forces, I would be surprised. But actually, if you think about it now, it's not that surprising, because it's part of this marketing that says that imperialism is enlightening. It's a progressive force. This is how imperialism has always portrayed itself. This is why US Republicans with a capital R are really stupid, because they don't understand. In some ways, they're the less effective imperialists. The Democrats, in some ways, historically have been more effective imperialists. I mean, they're both imperialists, but because the Democrats have always tried to sell imperialism with this, well, not always, since the Democrats became the party associated with like left liberalism, very much take left with a grain of salt. They're definitely not a left-wing party, but since the rise of FDR, since the party realignment, they've used this language of like empowering the common person, and now feminism and anti-racism and immigrants' rights and LGBT rights to defend imperialism. Whereas the more viciously conservative right wing, like the Trumps and the Reagans, They're just straight up neo-colonialists. We want to overthrow socialism anywhere, we want to privatize everything. And we see this very clearly with the Greens in Germany. I mean, they are viciously anti-China, viciously anti-Russia, extremely pro-EU. And I mean, you also mentioned here that the FDP as well, which is the most neoliberal party. It represents within the German capitalist class, the faction of the capitalist class that is kind of like the libertarian, that's like they have more of a fidelity to international capital than to national capital. And again, I'm not saying to support in any way the German national bourgeoisie or whatever. I'm just saying that like different parts of countries' capitalist classes have different interests. And you could say that the Christian Democrats represent more German capital, whereas the FDP and the Greens represent international capital. And they have a vested interest in maintaining this imperialist alliance with Washington and Brussels in defense of international capital, whereas parts of the German Christian Democrats have more of a fidelity to an extent to German capital, which actually is more interested in having better relations with China and Russia. We see this with France as well, by the way. There were big parts of the French capitalist class who wanted to have better relations with Iran and even with China. A lot of these capitalists, by the way, they want better relations with China because they do business in China. So it's a sign that capital is not always entirely unified, and there are internal contradictions in capital. Now, that doesn't mean that like they're our friends. They're still capitalists, but it means that we can understand those internal contradictions, and they can be exploited in different ways, especially when it comes to try to make space for progressive anti-imperialist movements, especially in the global South, but even in Europe. And that's why I actually think that sometimes it's not that surprising to see that the left liberals I was talking about are some of the most pro-imperialist forces in Europe. I mean, it shouldn't be surprising, it should be surprising, but it's not. Like some of the most pro EU people are the ones who call themselves socialists, but they're defending one of the most neoliberal institutions. But they've like trapped themselves in this game where they see like everything in this prism of like, for them being on the left is talking about like doing lip service to this idea of liberal values and all of that, when in reality they're allying themselves with capital and with international capital. And again, I'm not, this gets down to the whole stupid red-brown thing. I'm categorically not saying that revolutionary socialists and anti-imperialists should form an alliance with like the national right, like the conservatives or whatever. No, that's not what I'm saying. And this is exactly the straw man that the left liberal imperialists use to attack the anti-imperialist left, saying that the anti-imperialist left is trying to form an alliance with nationalists. It's not at all. No, but you can understand those contradictions and understand that they can be exploited and pushed in different directions. That doesn't mean forming an alliance with them, but it also doesn't mean forming an alliance with the liberal imperialists against them. And finally, the last thing I'll say here is this comes down to the US. There's a lot of people on the so-called left who call themselves socialists, even Marxists, who have taken this position of allying with the most neoliberal pro-war Democrats against the Republican Party, because their analysis is that Trump and the Republicans are a threat to Western democracy, which, by the way, the fact that they're talking about Western democracy shows that they're not really Marxists. They're not socialists. If you believe that democracy exists in these bourgeois societies, then you believe in bourgeois democracy. There's not democracies. As Lenin said, bourgeois democracy is always as it was in ancient Greek times, democracy only for the slave owners. The Democratic Party and the British Labour Party are not defending democracy against fascism. They're equally fascistic. Like Trump and Biden are equally fascistic in my view. So what I'm saying is that I'm not calling for an alliance with the Trumpists at all. That's ridiculous. No, what I'm saying is socialists need to be opposing an alliance with the left liberal imperialists that is not against so-called the threat of Trump or whatever. Like, no, because the reality is all they're doing is class collaborationism. And they're accusing the anti-imperialist left of class collaborationism when they're doing the same thing. So the Greens are a classic example of that in Germany. Like the Greens being the most pro-imperialist party, that to me is the danger of the future of the European left. The European left loving bourgeois democracy and an empire more than it loves socialism. And I think that's the fundamental contradiction of a lot of the left since the overthrow of the Soviet Union. Since the overthrow of the socialist bloc, a lot of the left in the global north has become liberal. They love bourgeois democracy more than socialism. So they condemn Maduro, they condemn Ortega, they condemn Cuba, they condemn all these countries. They condemn, I'll go there. I don't care if people call me a tanky. Like Lukashenko in Belarus, it's not a coincidence that he has maintained the most state control over his economy than any other leader in Eastern Europe, even than Russia, by the way. Belarus has more state control over the economy than Russia does. And all of the former Soviet republics, Belarus has one of the higher standards of living in the region compared to its neighbors, compared to the Baltic states, where unemployment and poverty is horrible, compared to Ukraine, by the way, where there's been a mass exodus of Ukrainians because poverty has skyrocketed and unemployment has skyrocketed. I don't care what people call me. I'll go there. Belarus has defended its sovereignty against attacks by imperialism. And that's why Belarus is being attacked. And also because the European Union wants to turn Belarus into another neoliberal colony. That's their goal. And okay, fine. Call me a tanky authoritarian or whatever. But like the reality is that these countries are defending their self-determination and they're defending their national interests. And they're also in many ways defending the interests of their own working class with social programs that help working people, that make their lives better. And if you think that we have to ally with capital against them in the name of fighting authoritarianism, then I don't consider you a socialist. You are a left liberal. You are a liberal who maybe you fancy the idea of social democracy, but at the end of the day, if you have to choose between socialism and bourgeois democracy, you choose bourgeois democracy. And I think that's a huge section of the global north left. They prefer bourgeois democracy over socialism. And if bourgeois democracy is threatened, they get scared and they ally with capital in defense of bourgeois democracy against socialism.
Man, I really wanted to ask you a question, but like that whole Belarus thing is really good. I mean, like just echoing off your point earlier about Russia being the second most unequal country in the world after the U.S. On the same metric, Belarus is is in the top 10 most equal in terms of GDP, like adjusted GDP, and it's obviously no coincidence that the EU is after them at the moment. And going back further on another point you said, I mean, you talk about the red-brown alliance, but of course, I mean, what we really see is this, in Europe anyway, this blue-brown alliance, I don't know, or blue-yellow-brown alliance, but anyway, where, you know, the EU spends a lot of its time posturing. It's like, oh no, Poland is so terrible. Oh no, why is Hungary doing this? And then as soon as they're doing horrible things to Belarus, like, it's okay. It's fine. So, yeah, I guess just the last point I want to go off of is, what is the, so there seems to be a lot of contradictions within the EU, but of course it all stays together because it's, you know, because they're all bound together by, it's a banking cartel. Bankers like each other, you know, they drink together, sleep with each other's wives, and so on. I mean, the question is, yeah, do you see any individual countries splitting away? Certainly not Ireland. We're like a EU-US condominium. They've got us on both sides. It's very bad. But like, I know that Italy signed up to the Belt and Road Initiative, or something to do with it, in recent months, since COVID and since the disaster of everything. The EU has not responded to it well. So the question is, do you see more fragmentation within the EU, and do you see that as an opportunity for, well, of course it's an opportunity, but do you see it as a positive opportunity as opposed to a negative nationalistic one?
Well, like I said, countries in Europe exercising policies that are in their national interest against the European Union is not inherently bad, because it hurts the European Union. And I mean, now if they're brutalizing immigrants, then that's obviously a bad thing, right? But like, especially in terms of the economy. So Germany building a pipeline with Russia, like, I mean, there's nothing inherently bad with that in any way. In fact, it actually weakens imperialism by creating more contradictions within imperialism. So that's a different thing. I'm not in any way like saying that like countries taking these hard line policies against immigrants, like that's horrible, of course. And we see, again, to underscore this point I made earlier, we see the hypocrisy of the European Union, these left liberals claiming they're socialists and talking about how we have to defend the European Union because of free movement. And then meanwhile, look how great free movement is over in the Polish-Belarusian border. Like it doesn't seem very free to me. Like the European Union in a lot of ways is against free movement. It's free movement of capital, certainly not free movement of people, right? So there's the hypocrisies in those senses. But I think that, look, we have to be honest here. If the European Union breaks apart, the liberals might get scared, but that's good. That's because that opens potential space for the left. The left cannot operate in the European Union. You all know that better than I do. It is impossible. Countries in the European Union do not have economic sovereignty. They don't have their own domestic currency, which means that Germany, the German central bank, and to a lesser extent, the French central bank control them. Because if you don't have your own currency, you can't have your own domestic economic policy, as Michael Hudson has shown really very cleverly and brilliantly. So especially in a country like Ireland, whose economy is a fraction of the German economy or the French economy. So, and we see this so clearly with Italy and Greece and Portugal in the so-called south of Europe. I mean, they've been so brutalized. It really is like the geopolitical equivalent of someone in an abusive relationship, where they continue to be abused and attacked by the EU, but they insist they have to stay in the EU because it would somehow be worse. How could Greece be worse off? And this is the historic betrayal of Syriza, right? This is why, I mean, I mentioned Yanis Varoufakis earlier, and like, I mean, his comments on China have been pretty good and welcome, but I mean, what Syriza did was a historic betrayal of the left that will go down in infamy as one of the biggest one of the largest acts of damage that the left has been done to the left in decades. I mean, absolutely historic. If they were able to, I understand that like they were being threatened. I also understand, I've heard high-level officials have said that, and this is a critique of Russia, by the way, that Greece actually had high-level meetings in Russia and said that they wanted to leave the European Union, and they wanted to sign an economic alliance and potentially a military alliance with Russia for protection, but that Russia at the time was trying to improve its relations with the West, because this was right after the 2014 Ukraine crisis in Crimea, and Russia was under sanctions. And also, this is also at a time when Russia and Turkey had really bad relations, and then Turkey would go on and shoot down a Russian plane. So to be fair, it's a critique of Russia that Greece was trying to find an ally to help support it if it went out of the European Union, and Russia let it go hanging. It's very different now than it was back then. But anyway, the point is that I think that's a sign of this fundamental contradiction of the European left, where you have to choose, which do you like more, socialism or the European Union? Which do you like more, socialism or imperialism, neoliberalism, and the European Union? Like, those are your choices. And in the case of Britain, like, there was a very clear choice, and Labour destroyed it. And I don't want to be pessimistic, but it's hard to be optimistic after that, because you don't need a PhD in rocket science to understand what happened, or political science for that matter. As you know, as Michael Prenti often jokes, that the years that he studied for his PhD in political science were the most apolitical years of his life. But all you have to do is look. There were two national elections that Corbyn contested. In the first, he did well above expectations and came very close to winning on a platform of supporting a left-wing Brexit. And in the second election, he was crushed and destroyed on a platform of calling for a new referendum, which is basically soft pro-EU. It's not, you don't need to be smart. And where were they crushed in the second election? They were crushed in the Red Wall, in these working class communities in the north of Britain that had been major bastions of working class politics for decades. I mean, how much clearer can the message be from that? The European Union is a neoliberal institution, and the left needs to be leading the charge and opposing it. And what's weird is that like 10 years ago, it was Jean-Luc Mélenchon was openly Eurosceptic. Corbyn was openly Eurosceptic. There were a lot of people in Europe who were openly Eurosceptic. Some of them came to power, I mean, to an extent. I mean, Corbyn never came to power, but like they came close to taking power, and they weakened their positions and became soft in the European Union. And then Euroscepticism became associated with the right wing, which is insane. The European Union is itself a right-wing institution. But now we see this attempt to rebrand by these right-wing idiots who call themselves like right-wing populists or whatever. There's nothing populism about the right wing. There's nothing populism about allying with capital. And we see this in the US too, with now like these Trump people who are like, we're the true populists. No, you're not. You're funded by a bunch of billionaires. Like, it's not populism. That's why they use the term populism, because there's no class element of populism. It's the people. We're the people. No. So, and to answer your question concretely, where could it be? I mean, you all would know that question better than I do. I mean, I do follow European politics closely, but like, what's sad is that I would think a place like Ireland would have so much potential. And that's why I love that you are the Workers' Party, right? Because like, you all could have serious potential. Like I said, in the US, there's been this debate about patriotic socialism. Like I said, I actually don't agree with the idea of a US patriotic socialism, because the US is a settler colonial. It's a settler colony that was built on genocide. There still are indigenous nations who deserve self-determination. There still are oppressed nations. Hawaii needs to be independent, all this, whatever. It's a complicated thing in the US, but in Ireland, it's not complicated at all. Like, there's a long, proud history of progressive nationalist struggle. And I would hope that like there could be the creation of this left nationalist bloc that is anti-imperialist and socialist, or at least very progressive, and that would support a move out of the European Union in defense of these policies, and that could do so in alliance with countries like China and Russia and Iran, and I mean, the socialist movements in Latin America. Like, there's a possibility for that. I get that, like, I know that that's what you're all trying to do, but it's very hard because of how much power capital has. But I got to say, like, I don't really see any countries in Europe that make me confident. I mean, you could say that Serbia, although they have a right-wing government right now, I'm not in any way praising their government, but Serbia has played an interesting role. Serbia just hosted the Non-Aligned Movement Summit. And Serbia also, they have played this role like of a kind of balance between Europe and like the kind of Eurasian bloc, and more leaning toward the Eurasian bloc. Now, Serbia is not an example in terms of economic policy. Like, that's the thing about a lot of these governments, is that because, I mean, let's be real, after the first Cold War, socialism was defeated in most parts of the world. It was a time of horrible counter-revolution. And there were a few countries that held on, the DPRK, Cuba, you know, like to a lesser extent, like Libya, Syria, like they did partially liberalize their economies, but like they did hold on. But a lot of these countries were defeated. So I think, especially in Central Europe with the destruction of Yugoslavia, and we see Poland now, like it's hard to see like a lot of these movements being necessarily a kind of like model for the future. So my answer isn't very optimistic. I'm interested in what you guys think, but I think that there's a lot of possibility. If you look at what people, even voters, like we have to look beyond bourgeois democracy, but even if you look at elections, a lot of these policies are very popular, like opposing the European Union, but universal healthcare, universal education, workers' protections, labor rights, like in non-interventionist foreign policy, improving our relations with China and Russia, not being part of these dumb wars in Ukraine and Iraq and Syria and Libya. Like those are all popular policies. But I mean, for me, from looking at it as a foreigner, as a North American from abroad, I think that one of the biggest problems with the European left is it's basically the same problem with the US left. It's a liberal left. It's not a socialist left. It's a liberal left. It's more concerned with winning the approval of like suburban upper middle class, like people who have already accommodated with capital and with the media. And it's not as concerned with the working class base of labor. And they're more interested in accommodating with like the sectors of like petty bourgeois capital that have influence in the media and influence in the bourgeois political parties, as we saw in the case of the people who destroyed Corbyn's campaign and who love the European Union.
Well, I always like to end on a pessimistic note. It's the most revolutionary thing to do. So I think that's the best place to leave off. It's like everyone go home and think, and feel bad about yourself. That's
I'll say that you all are the ones, like, you're the hope, right? Like the Workers' Party and all the other movements, like there are movements like you all your comrades across Europe. And I got to say, like, I'm not trying to be pessimistic, but being very, very real. There were a lot of people had hope 10 years ago. There was this wave. There was Syriza, totally destroyed. There was Jeremy Corbyn in Labour, totally crushed. There was Jean-Luc Mélenchon in France, who, I mean, kind of still has a chance. But from the people in France I've talked to, they've said the same thing, that like he's not going to win. Die Linke has lost. And I think that like the European left, not you all, because I mean, you're like the actual European left, but like the kind of more mainstream European left really needs to think hard about why it's been so thoroughly crushed. Because there was a lot more potential 10 years ago when they were Eurosceptic, and now they've all been crushed and they all love the European Union and they can't understand why they're so weak. Like, to me, it's not that confusing what happened, but I mean, you're all part of the good left movement that is growing.
It's certainly not. But let me rephrase my last comment because I feel slightly misunderstood. We need pessimism of the mind and optimism and what?
The will.
Yeah, that's it. That's the one. But yeah, I think well, look, the question I think that we all need to ask ourselves at the end of tonight is, what can we do in our own countries or wherever we are to reach out to people and to try and make our point better understood and get through to people? And I think that's the important part. And you've definitely touched on a lot of what these other countries are doing. You've certainly touched on in Ireland, or in certain places anyway, to be more general, that yes, it's like there's a easy coalition of, it's like of national determination, sovereignty, and socialism that should be tapped into. And of course, the easiest thing for anyone in the EU is Euroscepticism. They're just anti-EUism. I don't know why it's called Euroscepticism. I'm not a skeptic of the EU. I fucking hate it.
Well said. Yeah, if that's the lesson, I mean, fuck the EU. The only thing I agree with Victoria Nuland on is fuck the EU. We say it for different reasons, but fuck the EU.
That's the best place to leave off. Well,
that's the hope, is bring back the Eurosceptic left. Bring back
absolutely.
the Eurosceptic left.
Well, From
And
there, Ben.
for also for countering the second Cold War, that's the only hope too. Like, because the European Union is totally on board with the new Cold War.
Yep. And I do not want to die in a trench in the Ukraine.
By the way, there are literal trenches
Which
in
side?
Ukraine right now. There was this article recently.
Which side?
Sorry, Ben.
There was this article recently published about describing how horrible the conflict is in Ukraine right now, and like there are World War I style trenches, and the only difference is they have Wi-Fi. Like it's horrible.
They also have Nazi flags, though. So
Yeah. I guess it's in that way it's pretty similar to World War II.
All right. Well, I guess we might wrap it up there. But Ben, I'd really like to thank you for your time. It's always great to have these big long sessions where we get the most out of them. And honestly, you've got so many thoughts, and it's great to just get the blast of information out of you whenever you can.
No, it's my pleasure. It's really a pleasure to talk to all you